You know what's crazy? We talk endlessly about boomers and their entitlement or how millennials get a bad rep. We scrutinize Gen Z like they're some fascinating social experiment. But what about Generation X? They exist in this strange sort of cultural blind spot. You see them everywhere, but you don't really see them. They're the ones who don't need 3 follow-up texts to confirm plans. They're the colleague who solves problems without announcing it, the parent who seems oddly comfortable with silence. They built the architecture of the digital world we live in, then they watched everyone else perform their lives inside of it. And here's what no one has bothered to examine. Their psychology is the most misunderstood of any living generation, not because it's complicated, but because the world they were built for no longer exists. Gen X grew up in what psychologists call a period of structural neglect, not because their parents didn't care, but because the cultural architecture of the 1970s and 80s simply didn't prioritize constant supervision. Latchkey childhoods were the norm. Divorce rates were climbing. Both parents were entering the workforce in numbers. This wasn't about bad parenting. This was about a generation of kids who learned very early that adults were just busy, and that survival meant figuring things out on your own. And psychologically, this has profound implications. When a developing brain repeatedly experiences emotional self-reliance, the neural pathways that form around age 7 through 12, the ones that govern emotional regulation and social bonding, get shaped by one consistent message: you are on your own, and that's fine. But here's the thing, this isn't a disorder. It's a highly functional adaptation to an environment that rewarded self-sufficiency. And that environment wasn't just about being home alone after school. It was culturally reinforced everywhere. The movies Gen X grew up with celebrated the lone wolf, the kid who didn't need anyone, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller, Stand By Me. These weren't just stories, they were blueprints. They told a generation, your peers matter more than your parents, institutions will let you down, and being cool means not needing too much from anyone. So when people say Gen X is cynical, what they're often missing is this. Cynicism in this context is pattern recognition. It's not that Gen Xers expect the worst because they're pessimistic, it's that their nervous system learned early to scan for disappointment as a protective mechanism. When you grow up watching promises break, systems fail, and adults check out, your brain doesn't develop blind optimism. It develops calibrated skepticism. And that's not pathological, that's adaptive. Here's where it gets more complicated, because this wiring comes with a trade-off that most people never talk about. Gen X learned to be competent, resourceful, and emotionally steady under pressure. They can handle chaos without falling apart. They don't need constant reassurance. These are strengths, real ones. But the cost is this: they often struggle to ask for help even when they need it. They can come across as emotionally flat, not because they don't feel deeply, but because they were never taught that feelings required an audience. And in a world that now valorizes emotional transparency and constant communication, they can feel like relics, out of step, too hard, too distant. Here's the paradox. The very traits that made Gen X so good at surviving the world they grew up in are the traits that make them feel alienated in the world we live in now. They were raised to not need people, and now they're surrounded by a culture that insists connection is everything. They were taught that competence meant solving your own problems, and now vulnerability is considered strength. They learned that being low maintenance was a virtue, and now we celebrate those who loudly advocate for their needs. And yet, if you ask someone from Gen X whether they'd trade their independence for more emotional fluency, most would hesitate, not because they're stubborn, but because this identity, this way of being in the world, is so deeply embedded it feels like who they are. It's not a mask they put on, it's the architecture of their inner world, and dismantling that, even partially, feels like losing something essential. What's important to understand is this: there is no correct way to be wired. Gen X's emotional style isn't better or worse than the hyper-connected, therapy-fluent generations that came after. It's just different. It was forged in a different world, under different conditions, and it served a purpose. Some people need to process everything out loud. Others need silence to make sense of things. Some people heal through connection. Others heal through solitude. None of these are wrong. They're just different strategies the nervous system developed to navigate life. But here's what often goes unacknowledged. Gen X carries a quiet kind of loneliness that's hard to name. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being fundamentally misunderstood, of living in a world that now tells you the way you're wired is a problem to fix, of watching younger generations pathologize your self-reliance as avoidance, your independence as fear of intimacy, your calm as emotional repression. And the cruel irony is that Gen X was taught not to complain about it, so they don't. They just keep going, quietly competent, quietly disconnected, quietly wondering if anyone actually gets it. If you recognize yourself in this, know that your way of being makes sense. It's not a glitch. It's not something you failed to outgrow. It's a coherent response to the world you grew up in. And while the world has changed, while the rules of emotional engagement have shifted, you don't owe anyone an apology for the wiring you developed when you were just trying to survive. There's value in your steadiness, in your ability to endure without fanfare, in your quiet refusal to perform your inner life for an audience. You were shaped by a specific moment in time, and that shaping has consequences, both beautiful and complicated. If this landed with you, if it named something you felt but couldn't quite articulate, there's more to explore here. More about how we're all walking around with invisible blueprints written long before we had any say in the matter. And understanding those blueprints, really understanding them, changes everything.